Today, we're focusing on anger, trust, and connection. So, if you were around in November, December, this will be a very familiar picture for you, the polyvagal theory and the autonomic ladder. And I wanted to bring it in right now to talk about emotional flooding, freeze, and fight, and how that all works. So, this is the work of Dr. Stephen Porges, and Deb Dana is one of the people who works with him and is brilliant in terms of taking this work into, she's a social worker, and taking this work into our lives and how we can work with it. She's got a couple of books, and she has an online course on Sounds True about the nervous system that's also very, very good if you wanted to go deeper into this. What Dr. Porges talks about in his polyvagal theory is that we have three kind of main developments in our nervous system. And the dorsal vagal is the below the diaphragm. It's our guts, and it's a freeze response. It's a collapse response. I can't cope with anything. I'm just going to shut down. And when we talk about COVID and the pressure that we feel in our society right now, a lot of people are in this dorsal vagal state. It's a shutdown state. It could be an extreme kind of a freeze where we've learned that if we pop our head up, we're going to get whacked or something. And so we really try to hide. And it could also be that when we're having trouble breathing and regulating our nervous system, that we might be in this freeze state as well. So dorsal vagal is quite common. And when we talk about going into fight, flight, freeze, this is the dorsal vagal. It's the primitive, we share this with the reptiles, and it's a primitive system. In order to get out of dorsal vagal, we need to come up the ladder into sympathetic arousal. So sympathetic arousal is fight and flight. And we don't necessarily need to have a fight response or something like that, but we need to come up to get some energy moving so that we can come out of that frozen state. And when we look at fight, flight, and freeze, we tend to have a lot more shaming around people who go into fight responses than we do who go into freeze responses. So if we're going into a freeze response, we're not likely to be causing trouble in relationships. We're not blurting things out. We're not being nasty. We're generally just kind of disengaged, which can also be very hurtful. And it can be such a lost opportunity. So when I look at being in freeze in relationships, what I look at is this kind of a not very engaged. And I can understand the pressures and the historical kind of things that led to that. But it's a real loss for everybody when we're in freeze as well as when we're in fight or flight. So it's helpful to understand that. And then the really important part that Dr. Porges talks about is that neuroception, which is our nervous system's perception of threat, it happens without our conscious awareness. So this isn't something that we plan. I'm going to be afraid of this person. I'm going to go into a fight response. We're always scanning our environment for cues to let us know how safe we are or if we're under some kind of threat. So we scan it in our own system if we are holding our breath or if we have that gut clench or something like that. That's a signal in our body that there's something going on here. And we look around, and that's one of the reasons why we'll look around and say 5 things I can see are this and 4 things I can feel, because we want to get back into the present moment environment and between people as well. We are always assessing what's going on in other people's nervous systems. If we were going to stop and pause here for a moment and look around the room and look around for cues of safety or unsafety in your body, in the environment, and from another person. So one of the things that happens with us is that when we're coming in this class, we often see the same faces and names on the screen, on the Zoom screen. So we might look around, and in our nervous system, we're perceiving that we're safe to be here. And so that's one of the reasons that we're able to open up and share the way we do. So let's take a moment. What's your brain predicting based on what's happening? Are you up in the ventral vagal where you feel connected to the greater world? So that's when we come up out of fight or flight. So freeze, fight, flight would come up into a feeling of connection. Are you feeling that way right now? And how do you know that you're feeling that way? What's going on? What are the cues? So, this is something when we talk about somatic mindfulness, this is a big part of what we're talking about. What are the cues of safety? What is the neuroception? Do we feel safe? Do we feel uncomfortable, comfortable? What's going on in our nervous system? And then from there, we go into why do I feel that way? What's going on that I feel that way? And we really see how historically we bring that historical experience into this moment. And then we can look at it and kind of come to a present moment perception that's more accurate because we're able to really see it clearly. So one of the things about emotional flooding, when we think about emotional flooding, we often think about going into a fight response. So we're just overwhelmed by something that's going on and we feel just really flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. And sometimes we'll go into a freeze response. And when people say she really shut down, that's what's going on. Where there's a flooding and there's a feeling of I can't be here anymore. And we're going to go into some kind of a response. So the cue or the thing that's helpful to remember with this is not that emotional flooding is a bad thing. It's just something that happens in our nervous system, but that it takes about 20 minutes for that flood of hormones to settle. And so to recognize when it's happening is very helpful. And then to be able to do something to get grounded again. So we might, if we're having a discussion with somebody and we notice we're starting to get really flooded, it might be helpful to say, I'm feeling really emotionally flooded if the person knows what that is. Or just I'm feeling like I really need to take a break for 20 minutes. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to do some breathing. And sometimes we can just do that even in the midst of a conversation when we're starting to feel like that. Just, I have to go to the bathroom or I'm really thirsty. I'm going to get some water. Would you like some? We need to do something to break that cycle that's going on. And then something that will help us to settle and get grounded. And so these emergency practices on my website, there's a bunch of them in there that will help us if we can remember. We could hold our own hand, we could do some box breathing. And then one of the things to keep in mind is the kindness and compassion, kindness for ourselves and for other people. And if we can have a habit or develop kind of a focus of when I start to see that I'm emotionally flooded, when I start to see I'm getting triggered by something, or when I see the other person that I'm with is starting to feel that way, just to be kind and compassionate and patient and kind of realistic. Okay, that's what's going on right now. It's not actually going to help if I go into a discussion about this right now. I need to stop. And maybe I can say, I need 20 minutes to settle my system, and then I'll come back and talk to you later about this. And they might not be very happy about that. But to be able to figure out ways to take care of ourselves is very important when we're doing this really courageous work. So this is the unconscious. The neuroception is unconscious. We get triggered into fight, flight, freeze responses when we feel threatened. And then we fight for our survival. So some people go into a fight response to survive. Other people go into a freeze response, and some go into flight. They just get out of there. But what's common with all of them is that we disconnect and we lose touch with our shared humanity. When we're looking at ventral vagal, that's a state of flow where you're trusted and connected. You feel safe. You feel like you can be social with people. And we need to be moving. We need to recognize when we're in fight, flight, freeze, where we are on that vagal ladder. and then be able to move up into a state of that. So I wanted to pause here again for a moment and just imagine or remember, what does it feel like in your body when you feel that state of trust and connection? And you might bring to mind a person, a place, a pet. What does it feel like in your body? And use all of your senses to kind of remember that. You can visualize it, the sounds, the smells, who's there, who's not there, where are you, your location. Take some deeper breaths and let that be present for a moment. And sometimes just taking some deeper breaths, letting our body soften. So if you're clenching your teeth, if your shoulders up around your ears, if you're clenching in your gut, see if you could relax that for a bit. We have this two-way communication. Our mind has thoughts in it. In this case, we're remembering or imagining what it feels like to be in that trust and connect state. And then that affects our body. So then our breath gets a little bit more full, our body softens. And as that happens, then it encourages the feeling, it makes that stronger. So this can go in a negative direction or a positive. So right now we're really focusing on the feeling of trust and connection. What does that feel like in your body? And as you think about times when you get kind of thrown out of that, when you get triggered into a fight, flight, freeze response, what is it that's helpful for you to come back into this feeling of ventral vagal, the trust and connect? For many of us, it's the breath, might be to notice your feet on the ground, to look around and notice the safety of the environment that you're in. Notice what it is that supports you in coming back into that regulated state. So now that we've done a little kind of journey through the fight, flight, freeze and the vagal system, let's do an inquiry around anger and specifically. So we've talked in the last few weeks about how our brain soaks up all the impressions from everything, from everybody. It remembers everything from our whole life, and it uses all of that information to make predictions. These predictions are based on our past experience. And if we've had a lot of experience that a certain thing's going to happen, then we're not going to easily believe that something different's going to happen. We don't want to get rid of this part of the way the brain works. It's very helpful. It helps us to know that certain cues are something that we need to pay attention to so that we can protect ourselves. And we also know that we have a higher level brain and also humanity, that we don't want to be operating from the primitive brain and nervous system all the time. So, what does your brain predict will happen to you if you feel your anger? So, there's some examples here. I can't handle the intensity, it'll never stop. I'll just be devastated, it'll take over. Then we have some of those shame based ones, like I'll lose my good person card. People who are good don't feel anger. And I'll have to make a change in my life and relationships. So if we really got in touch with the situation, would we be able to stay in the situation? So let's take the first part of this first. Just what would happen if you were to feel your anger? And we'll take a couple of minutes for this. To feel it in your body, stay present with your body. And if you're looking at thoughts, we could do some tapping if they get too intense, but otherwise, just to continue to look at them. You could also put them into a frame, put them on the other side of the room. So we use those tools when we want to stay present in this moment with these thoughts and feelings. What would happen if you were to feel your anger? What's the worst thing that could happen? And let yourself kind of inquire into that. And notice if your mind or your predictions are coming into the second category, the prediction around what would happen if you were to express your anger. So some of these that are on the screen might be something that resonates with you, it might be something different. And notice when the expression of anger, the examples here are actually a fear of going into a fight response. Because we can express our anger in many, many different ways, not all of which blow up our life. So let's sit with that for a bit as well. What does your brain predict will happen if you were to express your anger, if you were to go into a fight response, if you were to express your anger in another way? What comes up around that? Maybe you don't have a lot of experience with expressing your anger or the fight response. So notice what that feels like too. Does it feel like a freeze? Does it feel like any of this relates to why that you might not be so expressive with your anger that you don't go into a fight response very often, or it's not very volatile? Just notice what your experience there is too. And stay really connected with your body and your breath. And then let that come to a pause. And notice, especially around the expressing your anger, how much of that has to do with what happened when you were a child or other people expressing it earlier in your life. If the people around you blew up, rejected you, if you were afraid of them, then it would be really natural to feel like that's what's going to happen to us. That will be the result if I go into a fight response. notice the strings and the connections there. I wanted to touch a little bit on passive aggression. When we learn that it's dangerous for ourselves and for others sometimes to be angry, then we might move into this kind of not really ever admitting that we're angry. And everything just kind of stews underground. So, Lamar Rod Owens, who wrote the book Love and Rage that we talked about last week, he says, my anger devolved into passive aggressiveness, and as it devolved, I lost contact with it. So, when we're afraid of our anger, or when we're being shamed, or we shame ourselves for being angry, we disconnect. And sometimes that we might call this repressed anger or passive aggressiveness. My dad was never angry, but I know with my mom, he was passive aggressive. And he would call that stubbornness. So we disconnect from ourselves to avoid being the kind of person who gets angry. That might be part of it. But also, we don't want to, we have a very genuine impulse not to be hurtful to other people. We don't want to rage. And so, how are we going to express it or feel it or metabolize it? Because when we suppress it, it goes into this losing connection with our body. And then we don't really have, so we're more in that dorsal vagal system at that point. We don't have access. We're in kind of a state of freeze. But then in that, there's this roiling underground. We might have a lot of angry comments in our mind, like, I'm going to get that person back, or they might think they're so hot, but they're not, or we might have a lot of that going on in our mind. And so that's something that we can also be aware of. This one of the ways that this manifests is in passive aggression. So it'd be helpful just to pause for another little bit here and notice what comes up for you when you're thinking about that. And then let's move into the inquiry. So we'll do this for about 5 minutes or so. It's not really long enough to get into the whole thing, but it's enough to kind of dip into it a little bit. So, some of the beliefs that we might have about anger is that we're powerless to protect ourselves, that good people don't get angry. The freedom is when emotions move through freely. It doesn't trigger us into a fight response. We're able to feel and express anger in other ways than the fight, flight, freeze responses. And that we remain, even when we're angry, we remain in a state of connection. And we spoke about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about really being with somebody who is in freeze and being able to stay present with them and connected. It's a very similar dynamic, although a little bit harder when somebody is in a fight response. So, whatever inquiry kind of catches your eye, what will change if I feel my anger? Or the reverse inquiries, I can afford to feel my anger, or I can afford to express my anger appropriately. Stay connected with your body and your breath. Keep noticing your relationship with this. If you've started holding your breath or if you've lost touch with your body, then just come back in. If your mind's gone off to something else, notice that. That would be a flight response. And do your best to stay present in this moment. Stay really connected with your body as you're working with this. Notice what's coming up. And it's always helpful to bring kindness in, especially if there's something that's quite intense here. You could do some tapping, put things in a frame, put some space around the energy in your body. Keep coming back to being grounded and steady. We'll do this for another minute or two. But let yourself really be a witness to what it is that's coming and going here. As we're finishing the inquiry, come back to ventral vagal. So notice if you're in a dorsal freeze response, if you're aware of your body, bring your attention into your feet on the floor, the seat on the chair, however you're seated. Move your body around a little bit. That might help. Take a few deeper breaths. If you're in a fight or flight response, notice that. And then see if just with this kind hearted connection to ourselves, we can come back into the state of feeling connected with ourselves, with each other. Let the inquiry move to the background and come back into this steadier, more grounded state for a moment. And then let's come back to the group.